Hi there, everyone. My name is Joe Adamski, and this is my behavior learning theory presentation for EDU 502. Today in the presentation, we'll be touching on these topics. First, I'll introduce what is behavior learning theory. Then I'll go on to describe how behavior learning theory works. After that, we'll briefly discuss some of the major contributors to behavior learning theory and the effect that their contributions had on BLT. Then we'll discuss how to use behavior learning theory in your classroom. Then we'll take a look at an example of how behavior learning theory works in the classroom. Finally, there will be a brief survey at the end for you to discuss. Let's jump into it. First and foremost, behavior learning theory, as cited by the article Behaviorism in Education. Behavior learning theory is a branch of psychology that focuses on how people learn through their interactions with the environment. It is based on the idea that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning, which is a process of reinforcement and punishment. So the idea behind it is when you reinforce a behavior that you expect to see, it will theoretically occur more often. And when you punish a behavior, theoretically, it should be happening less frequently. Let's talk about how behavior learning theory works. I like to equate behavior modification and behavior learning theory to a game of chess, where you're trying to not necessarily manipulate, but try to predict how certain behaviors will change, develop, or become extinct over a period of time. So much like in a game of chess, you are making specific choices to get the other person to behave in a certain way. So specifically, some ways that you can change those behaviors that you're seeing is through either positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, or punishment. The most straightforward of the three is positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, as cited in Behaviorism in Education, is rewarding desired behaviors to increase the frequency of the behavior that you want to see. So, for example, using treats, reward game time, verbal praise, etc. are all examples of positive reinforcement. When we're talking about positive versus negative, though, we're not necessarily talking about positive as in it's good and negative as in it's bad. When we discuss positive and negative in this context, positive means you're adding something to change the behavior, and negative is where you're removing something to change the behavior. And that's where negative reinforcement comes in. Again, Behaviorism in Education cites negative reinforcement as the removing of something undesired to increase the frequency of a behavior. For example, you could reduce the amount of homework that a student could do or has to do if they perform well on an assessment. Now, the idea behind it is that removing of an extra assignment is the carrot to get the student to try their best on that assessment. Next, let's talk about punishment. Now, punishment is where you are applying negative consequences to discourage the frequency of a behavior. So you're adding a consequence that is unwanted rather than adding or taking something away. So for example, a verbal reprimand could be considered a punishment. Timeout or a loss of privilege are also examples of punishments. Punishments can also be positive or negative. It just depends on the type of punishment. For example, with reprimands, you're adding something in as the form of punishment to hope to reduce the frequency of the behavior. However, loss of privileges would be considered negative because you're taking away those privileges that the child or student enjoys to reduce the frequency of the behavior. Now, out of the three, I would say positive reinforcement is the most effective because it's the most straightforward. It's simply, I do the expected thing, I get something I want in return. And I believe the least effective way of changing behavior is through punishment, because it doesn't necessarily teach the expected behavior. It just teaches how to avoid receiving the consequence. So, for example, when I was a kid, rather than showing my mom tests that I did poorly in to avoid punishment, I would just say, oh, no, my teacher hasn't graded it yet, even though the test or assessment has been graded for close to a week and I've had it in my folder. So this is how behavior learning theory works. It's through either reinforcement or punishment to attempt to change the behavior. The goal of behavior modification is to bolster up those expected behaviors that you want to see and have the behaviors you don't want to see become extinct. And when you're talking about a behavior that is unexpected, like a child calling out, sometimes the best course of action would be to use that positive praise or positive reinforcement with that child when they do raise a hand quietly to get your attention, or you can use a strategy called parallel praise, where you're praising a student or peer that's nearby, so that way the child that's calling out kind of gets the message and says, oh, the teacher's happy when when so-and-so raises their hand, maybe I should give that a try next. So in my research, I found 4 psychologists that made major contributions to behavior learning theory, and each one of them had done an experiment or made a discovery that helped further along behavior learning theory, because behavior learning theory did not happen in a vacuum. It was stumbled upon and fine-tuned over the course of years. So those 4 contributors are Ivan Pavlov with his discovery of classical conditioning, Edward Thorndike and his law of effect, John Watson with his little Albert experiment, and he's also known as the father of the psychological school of behaviorism, and B.F. Skinner with his idea of operant conditioning. Let's talk about Pavlov first. So I discussed Pavlov in my previous presentation on psychological theorists. So this is a natural progression of those ideas. Pavlov's most famous discovery was that of classical conditioning. And Pavlov and his team discovered it on accident. They were studying dogs and their digestive processes, but then they discovered that once the dogs had figured out when someone was bringing them their food, they would begin to salivate. And that prompted Pavlov and his team to pull the thread of discovery, so to speak. So Nesbitt 2013 cites the study of how dogs salivate and how Pavlov could change their behavior through reinforcement. Pavlov had discovered that if he had rang a bell just prior to the dogs receiving food, the dogs would eventually then salivate whenever they heard the bell. So you can kind of see where that idea of that positive reinforcement is coming in, even though they didn't necessarily call it that at that time, because it was through that sequence of the bell ringing or that audio cue being heard by the dog, and then that triggering the response of the salivation because the dogs knew that the food was going to come next. Next, let's discuss Edward Thorndike. Edward Thorndike is best known for his advancement in behavior learning theory through his idea of the law of effect. According to Cherry 2023, she cites that Thorndike's law of effect states that the responses immediately following a satisfactory outcome become more strongly associated with the situation and therefore are more likely to occur. So again, it's that idea of that reinforcement happening, right? And you could even take that idea conversely. When there is a response that is unfavorable, theoretically, that behavior is less likely to occur again. So you can see that connection back to the positive reinforcement, or even at this point, the punishment aspect, where behavior A is happening, so reward is given, behavior A becomes reinforced and is stronger. Or behavior B is occurring, so punishment is occurring, making it theoretically less likely that behavior B happened in the future. Now let's talk about John Watson. John Watson, like I said, is known as the father of the psychological school of behaviorism. He was the psychologist best known for his push for making psychology a more objective science. Because at the time when Watson was making presentations at the university level, Sigmund Freud was one of the biggest names in psychology, and Watson's major criticism of Freud was that a lot of Freud's interpretations of what his clients were saying was very subjective. So Watson had made a push to try to make science objective and measurable. Now, in his contribution to behavior learning theory, I want to talk about a controversial experiment that John Watson had performed called the Little Albert experiment. Now, the Little Albert experiment is an experiment with which Watson and his team had taken a orphan toddler, I think he was about 11 months or so, and what they did was they wanted to see if they could pair a neutral stimuli with a negative response, or a fear response, I should say. And so what they did was they took this child and they sat him in a room with a white rat. Now, the white rat represented the neutral stimuli. The child, on their first interaction with the rat, was not afraid of it. They didn't show any positive or negative response to the rat. Then in the next experiment, what Watson and his team did was they tried to elicit a fear response by startling little Albert. And so they made a loud noise which startled him and got Albert to cry. And this is where it gets a little controversial, because they are now in a way kind of tormenting a child for science, but their discovery really set behaviorism in motion with what they discovered. So then what Watson and his team did next was they decided to pair that neutral stimulus, the rat, with the negative stimulus of the scary sound, and when they presented the child with the rat, they also made the startling noise, so then the child began to associate over and over again through repetition with the appearance of the rat and then being scared. So that way, when Albert was presented with the rat without the audio cue, that fear response was still elicited, because Albert had learned that when the rat appears, something scary happens. And again, this is all coming back to the way that we can modify and change behavior through positive, negative, and punishment reinforcements. So even though the situation where Albert was being presented with a rat and then a scary noise, because the fear response is happening more frequently, we would consider that response a response to a positive reinforcement. So like I said, positive doesn't necessarily mean good. Positive just means you're adding something in to change the behavior. Last, let's talk about B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner is best known for his idea of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is very similar to classical conditioning, where classical conditioning is a learned response through a stimuli that is occurring in the environment. Operant conditioning, as cited by Cherry 2024, is a learning method that employs rewards and punishments for behavior. So whereas classical conditioning only deals with that positive reinforcement, operant conditioning utilizes the full spectrum of reinforcement or punishment methods. Harvard University also even goes into further detail to describe operant conditioning as the shaping of novel behavior through successive approximations, the chaining of complex behavioral sequences via secondary reinforcers, the learned reinforcers, or superstitious reinforcers, which are behaviors that are reinforced by accident. The experiment that Skinner had used to further along this idea was through the Skinner box and the rat. So in his experiment, Skinner had placed a rat inside of a box where there was a button or a lever, and there was no encouragement for the rat to push this lever initially, but when the rat would push the lever, some food would come out to reinforce that behavior. So then every time the rat had pushed the lever, the rat would receive food. So then the behavior becomes reinforced, and the rat would push the lever more and more and more and more and more until the rat could no longer get any food. Then they did a similar experiment where whenever the rat would push the lever, rather than get food, they would get shocked by electrodes that were attached to the rat. So then that showed that the behavior could subside and even become extinct through the addition of that punishment, where that rat is hitting the lever and then receiving that negative consequence. And when it comes to superstitious behavior, the example that I have for you is when my wife and I taught our dog Reggie how to ring a bell to let us know that he needs to use the restroom. You know, we reinforced it using treats. Every time we would take him out, we would say, "Okay, buddy, now ring the bell." And at first he was terrified of it because it was the loud noise that kind of startled him. But over time, through that positive reinforcement with the treats, he would ring the bell. However, the superstitious behavior that Reggie had acquired by accident was, now every time he wants attention, he's ringing the bell. And that is a behavior that we did not intend to teach him. That was a behavior he just learned through that connection of whenever he would ring the bell, my wife and I would turn around and say, "Okay, do you need to go out?" So he made that connection, not where whenever he rings the bell, he goes outside to use the bathroom. That connection he made was, whenever I want mom and dad to pay attention to me, I ring the bell. So that's an example of a superstitious behavior. But how can you use behavior learning theory in the classroom? It's simple, and you can do it. The best way to use behavior learning theory in the classroom is through positive, negative reinforcement or through punishment. And I'm sure you're already doing this in your own classroom, so congratulations. You're already using BLT in the classroom. So, some examples of these things that you can use in your classroom are a reward system, a token system, things of that nature. Now, I'm going to lean more on the positive reinforcement side. Certainly, if you feel it necessary, punishment at certain times can be critical in developing and reinforcing or helping behaviors wane. But the example that I use in my own classroom is through Class Dojo. Now, Class Dojo is a behavior management system intended to utilize the ideas of operant conditioning, where whenever a student performs an expected behavior, the teacher can reward dojo points. The kids see the points added to their total, the parents get to see the points added to their total, and then whenever the child receives a positive dojo point, a positive bell ringing audio cue sounds, and that just makes the kid feel good and more likely to make that choice again in the future. And conversely, when a child is making an unexpected behavior, the teacher can choose to punish that behavior by adding a negative dojo point. So again, it's still that positive reinforcement, but it's where you're adding in that negative consequence to then try to subside that behavior and change the behavior. Another strategy that you can use in the classroom is through modeling. So the best thing that I can offer you is the idea of using that positive role model demonstration, where either you, the teacher, demonstrates the expected behavior and then shows the unexpected behavior as a way to help the kids differentiate between, yes, this is what we should do, and no, this is not what we should do. Or you can even use a peer example where you have a child role play and show the positive expected behavior as well as the unexpected negative behavior or unexpected behavior and the consequences that they can receive both by performing the positive expected behavior and the unexpected behavior. The next way that you can utilize behavior learning theory in your classroom is through shaping. Now, I like to call this the baby step method, where you are slowly, incrementally increasing the demand and rigor of the task that the child is doing with the same amount of rewards. So, for example, if you're trying to get a student to write an essay, you don't just put a blank sheet of paper in front of them with a pencil and say, okay, go ahead, write, especially if they're not a strong writer or not a confident writer. But what you can do is incrementally reinforce the behavior of them. You know, they pick up the pencil, you give them a reward, or you give them a small reinforcer to continue. They write down a sentence. You say, okay, awesome, you wrote down a sentence. Here's your reinforcer. Now write me 2 sentences. They write 2 sentences. You reinforce and you say, okay, now finish the paragraph. When you finish the paragraph, you'll get another reinforcer, and so on until you have the child writing you full essays for just that one reinforcer. One final way that you can use behavior learning theory in your classroom is through cueing. Now, the example that I have for you is call and response. Call and response is where you perform an audio cue that gets the students to respond. So things like class, class, yes, yes, or 1, 2, 3, eyes on me, 1, 2, eyes on you is a example of a call and response. But another call and response that I've used in the classroom is when I was teaching my students about adding and subtracting fractions, where we were discussing how do we figure out what we do for turning a fraction into an equivalent fraction so that way we could perform the operation. And I would have the students stand up and say what we do on the bottom, we must also do on the top. And the kids would perform that motion of what we do on the bottom, we also do on the top. It was almost ritualistic in the way that reinforces the ideas more strongly, because the saying it and the hearing it and the performing the kinesthetic body motion was enough to make that recall of that idea stronger. So then now whenever I say what I do on the bottom, the kids always respond, I also have to do on the top. Another example is one that I've seen in a 2nd grade classroom where the teacher is working with the kids on how to identify the difference between a 1-step problem and a 2-step problem. The students, when they identify the problem as a 2-step problem, they say 2-step or 1, 2, and they left, right, slap their hands on their thighs. Just a little way to keep the kids engaged, and I think that's great. But enough about the theory. Let's see it in action in the classroom. So I have a video that I found on YouTube from the YouTube channel EN4022 Podcasting Project School of Education, and the video is titled Behavior Learning Theory EN4022. Let's watch.
Okay lads, just do the questions on the board and you have no homework to do this evening.
Positive reinforcement is the process of encouraging or establishing a pattern of behaviour by offering a reward when the behaviour is exhibited. In this clip we see the teacher offering the students a reward of having no homework that night if they get all the questions done. The aim of this is that the students will in time automatically do their work straight away. This is an example of behaviour learning theory in the classroom. Here we see the students talking to each other, beginning to go off task. We see the teacher stand up and walk behind the students. This is a teaching strategy in which the teacher doesn't correct the student's behaviour. Instead, he walks behind them and prompts the student to stay on task. This is one of the ways in which a teacher can maintain a positive behaviour without disrupting the flow of the class. This is a practical example of classroom strategy associated with behavioural learning theory.
Okay lads, we'll have to move money move back to their back row.
As we can see here, the students are talking and being disruptive in class when they should be doing work. The teacher has to take action. He decides to separate them to prevent them from talking to each other and for them to do the work. This negative reinforcement links to Skinner's theory of operant conditioning. In this experiment, he shocked the rat when it touched the lever in the box. Similarly, the teacher has to move the students apart to prevent them from talking. It is an effective way of using a negative reinforcement in the classroom.
Alright, finally, I have an exit ticket for you. All I need you to do is, once you click this link, it'll take you directly to the Google form. It's one question. You can see it right in front of you. The question is, what are some behavior learning theory strategies that you use in your classroom? In a short paragraph of 2 to 3 sentences, describe what you use and how you utilize it in the classroom. And finally, these are my references that I utilize throughout the presentation. Alright everyone, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. See ya.